There's a mountain in Japan called Obasute-yama, literally, the mountain where the old woman is thrown away. Though a seemingly harsh tale, in its substance, it's a story of both sacrifice and love. During a time of extreme poverty, when the elder grandmother was no longer able to contribute to the welfare and sustenance of her family, it was the responsibility of the eldest son to carry his aged mother on his back, to make a long and arduous journey crossing ravines and stony surfaces to reach the top of the mountain. There, the old woman would be left to die. It's said that the old woman unfolded her cloth bag holding 2 rice balls. As they shared their last meal together, she talked about precious memories of her life, and her son tearfully listened. On his return journey home, he found that his mother had carefully dropped grains of rice along the way, marking a path so that he would find his way home. Densho, our community story keeper, has for years carried the burden of recovering the untold stories otherwise destined to die in silent oblivion. Each story preserved, like a fabled grain of rice, has been guiding us to find our way home, to the truth and to the reality of our historical experience. The storytellers will all pass someday, but the story keeper will never let us forget. Thank you to Tom and Densho for your vision and wisdom and for your great love for our community. Next slide. My parents never spoke to us about their lives in captivity during World War II, yet their experience left a powerful, mostly unconscious imprint on me and my brothers. Activating history, the theme for this evening's program, is, maybe not so coincidentally, an important theme in the field of psychology. Psychotherapists will often ask at some point early in the therapy process, what is your earliest childhood memory? This particular memory may hold important unconscious meaning for the person, and in remembering from the perspective of an adult, can lead to a deeper understanding of self. My earliest childhood memory is a train ride, standing in the aisle, barely able to reach the warm armrests on either side. I lift myself swinging back and forth to the rhythm of the moving train. The air is hot and musty. My older brother Kiyoshi is curled asleep across my mother's lap. The man beside me is a stranger. I'm to call him Oto-chan, Daddy. When I cry, he says to me softly, "Shikkari shinasai, nakanai de." Be strong, do not cry. Next slide. In one of the descriptions about the program tonight, it was said that I was born doing time. My birthplace was the Tule Lake Segregation Center, the maximum security prison for those deemed disloyal for having answered no to the government-imposed loyalty questionnaire. My father, a quiet literary man, hardworking and apolitical before his incarceration, signed a petition while incarcerated at the Topaz prison camp in Utah, stating he would be willing to respond affirmatively to the questionnaire, but only when his constitutional rights were restored. The petition was summarily dismissed by the authorities, who responded that loyalty could be demonstrated only by the men who were willing to fight for their country. Having answered no, my parents and brother were removed to Tule Lake. The Army's efforts to reinforce their numbers shifted from recruiting volunteers to drafting military-aged men from camp. My father spoke up at a meeting, opposing the Army's intention to draft men to be soldiers while being held in prison and into racially segregated combat units to fight in Europe and in the Pacific. Included in his 5-sentence statement, he said, "If we are to fight, we should be treated equal to the free people." As a result, he was labeled a troublemaker and charged with sedition. Living under indefinite detention with increasingly harsh conditions, freezing winters, blistering summers, shortage of coal and milk for the children. In despair, my mother wrote in her diary, "Because my children have a Japanese face, I don't want them to be American." Disillusioned by the unjust and oppressive conditions, the denial of their constitutional rights as American citizens, the ground slowly shifted beneath my parents' feet. Betrayed by the country of their birth, and with grave concerns for the future welfare of their children, they made the decision to make their way to a new life in Japan. With that in mind, my father had to now demonstrate his loyalty to the emperor, or as rumor had it, risk the possibility of imprisonment as suspected American spies upon arriving in Japan. He joined the Hoshidan, a militant pro-Japan protest organization, shaved his head, and participated in mandatory rallies and marches. Months after I was born, he was arrested, taken from us and held in the jail within the jail in Tule Lake. Without charges or due process, he was removed to a Department of Justice internment camp in Bismarck, North Dakota. After a year and a half of family separation, we were finally reunited with my father at the family internment camp in Crystal City, Texas. It was July 9th, 1946, after my parents' 4.5 years of prison life, when they were given $25 each and a one-way train ticket to Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1988, shortly after redress legislation had been passed, I visited the Smithsonian Museum to see the photo exhibit called A More Perfect Union about the Japanese-American incarceration. I remember the moment turning the corner into the exhibit hall and coming face to face with a large photograph of men standing in the Tule Lake jail. Though the image was blurred, I instantly recognized my father. All at once, I experienced weird, simultaneous explosion of emotion. Joyful recognition, shock, and numbing grief. What was he doing in jail? What happened? How could this be? It took several years to piece together the story, but eventually I was able to unearth my father's FBI file. And among the records I found, this mugshot. Wearing the same white sweatshirt, the torn collar, cuts and bruises on his face where he had been beaten. My grief was about how little I knew about my parents' World War II experience. What impact had that trauma had on me? And what had I passed on to my own children? I spent the next 10 years conducting Children of the Camps workshops, researching the long-term and intergenerational impact of the camp trauma on Japanese American families, filtering through the euphemistic language and self-justifying government narrative that had defined our experience. I learned about our collective trauma. I learned how the distorted narrative, much like the powerful abusive parent convincing the powerless victim child that the abuse was for her own good. We as a community, even after the war, still dependent on government approval, had internalized this official narrative. That evacuation and relocation was for our own good, that those who refused to comply were disloyal, that anyone with 1/16 Japanese blood was a risk to national security, that protests were riots, that loyalty could simply be determined by asking someone 2 questions. My father never spoke about his wartime experience. Trauma and family secrets have a way of disconnecting people, disconnecting them from their past and often shaping their relationships between parents and children. In my childhood, there was always a vague sense of anxiety that seemed to pervade our household. It wasn't a secret that we had been in camp, but I knew not to ask questions. Thus joining my family, my community, and the larger society in keeping the story of our incarceration stowed away in our unconscious, coated with a blurred haze of forgetting and framed by a distorted government narrative. A thorny wound to fester and never heal. Something seemed to permeate my parents' desire for us to be successful in the world, to be good students, to behave, to excel in whatever we undertook, and to absolutely never bring shame to the family. This something I came to understand had to do with protecting us children from the burden of the truth. But with it came a deep sense of shame and fearful insecurity. Shame so choking that it would prevent my mother and father from speaking up when they were shortchanged at a store, spoken to rudely, ignored in restaurants, hurled racist insults, and spit on. The insecurity was unspoken, but I know now was always threaded through their diligence and drive, their anxious need to be the very best, to do their job beyond criticism, often sacrificing their own health and well-being, and never trusting that they wouldn't be targeted again. I was a student at UC Berkeley in the 60s, where the emerging civil rights movement was taking center stage. Students and faculty were demanding their right to free speech on campus. As student protesters were being hauled off to jail in paddy wagons for demonstrating and committing acts of civil disobedience, my parents began calling me every night, urgently insisting that I not get caught up in the protest. We do not want to see your face in the newspaper. They had worked hard to make it possible for me to go to college, and I was to go to class and not let my studies get disrupted. Confused by the intensity of their emotions, a dutiful daughter, I walked towards my class while streams of students were going in the opposite direction. Voices loud over megaphones, electricity in the air. I got to class. There were only a handful of other students, and we waited quietly. Suddenly, the door flew open. The breathless, bearded professor came running down the aisle, jumped on top of the desk, and yelled, "God damn it, if you show up in class, I'm going to flunk every single one of you." My parents told me to come home. They needed to talk to me. As usual, my father left the room, leaving my mother to do the talking. Slowly, she unfolded the missing part of our family story. By the time I was born in Tule Lake, they had lost all hope for a good life in America and decided that the children would be safe, have a better chance if we lived in Japan. She paused. So we renounced our American citizenship. But the war ended in devastation, and our family there wrote to say their home had been destroyed. Grandmother had died of starvation. The children had no clothes. They had nothing to offer. Please do not come. I asked her, "Why didn't you tell us?" Tears rimmed her eyes. "We were afraid you would be ashamed of us." Now, I was probably wearing my tie-dyed t-shirt, a braid across my forehead, and probably a flower in my hair. Recovering from the shock, I said, "No, Mom, I'm not ashamed of you. I'm proud of you." We both cried, and I heard my father quietly go down the stairs. But her last words before I left that day were, "Please do not protest. Bad things will happen." It has taken me a lifetime to understand they had lived for years, Americans without American citizenship, never having committed a crime, released from physical captivity, yet still not free. They kept their heads down, worked hard without complaint. It was my brothers and I, through our good behavior, who were to secure our family's future. Their unspoken shame and insecurity underlying the pressure to be the model minority, the 110% loyal American, who never expressed any bitterness or anger, was passed down to us children, defining who we were, how we looked, what we deserved in life. We learned not to complain, to avoid being vulnerable, and to bear a never-ending need to strive. Bending like the great bamboo in a wind-blown forest, we learned to survive, shikkari shite, through silence and endurance. It seemed that silence had kept us safe. No monku, no offense. But the silence also kept many of us from realizing our dreams, from our artistic, creative, musical potential, from adventure and risk, as we were guided by our parents' fear to stay the middle road and reach only for what will bring respect and security. My personal lifelong gold standard for coping has always been the echo of my father's words to me: "Be strong, do not cry." It would be many decades after that long train ride from Crystal City when alarming current events would lead many Japanese Americans to awaken from their false sense of security that redress and reparations had afforded us. September 11th, 2001 shook many Japanese Americans. Our traumatic history had once again reared its ugly head as we heard FBI agents entering mosques, arresting Muslim leaders, random attacks on Sikhs wearing turbans, hate graffiti on the walls. Then calls for registering all Muslims, security at airports profiling people who looked like the enemy, and eventually a religion-based travel ban. Never again was now. Americans, but most of us, Japanese Americans, stayed home. Reluctance to speak out, possibly because, other than my family, people believed that bad things will happen. Our trauma had been triggered, and many of us reverted to the silence that had kept us safe. But it was the presidential election of 2016 when finally our outrage overrode our fear. We heard the familiar rhetoric and fear-mongering, the unhinged hate, demonizing targeted people of color. Yonsei millennials removed just enough from our World War II trauma, living a less insulated life, more entitled, audacious, with a broadened perspective of intersectionality, who grew up with abortion rights, climate change, and social media, were speaking out. We survivors, elders, children of the camps, who held, however thin the thread of historic memory, who could stand on the moral authority of having lived the incarceration, joined these outrageous millennials to call out the resonance of our own experience with mass incarceration, indefinite detention, separation of families, and racism, now targeting people of color deemed as the enemy. Stigmatized as criminals and rapists, not unlike the claims when we were spies and saboteurs. Men and women, mothers with children, were again being imprisoned for indefinite detention in what are once again euphemistically called family residential centers. It was then that many of us realized if we didn't speak up, if we didn't demand that human rights be upheld during a time when hysteria was running rampant, that was what we knew when bad things would happen. When we were rounded up, disappeared from our classrooms, our homes, our jobs, essentially nobody spoke up for us. America looked away, turned their backs on us. There were no marches, petitions, demonstrations. It was at the 2018 Tule Lake pilgrimage, a group of Yonsei rolled out giant banners and organized a live streaming, Instagramming, Twittering, Facebooking, TikToking protest in front of the Tule Lake jail, the place where my father was held and beaten. Standing with my brother and other elderly children of the camps, my heart swelled with emotions, feeling and hearing the strength of our shared voices. No bans, no walls, no more concentration camps. Kodomo no tame ni, there are children, set them free. I was swept back to images of all of us children deprived of our childhood. Some still living behind psychological barbed wire fences. And I cried. I cried for me, my family, my community, and I cried for the children being held in mass prison camps today. In January of this year, a handful of survivors and descendants Mike Ishii, Nancy Ukai, Chizu Omori, and I decided to hold a demonstration just 45 miles east of the former Crystal City prison camp, where we had been held as children, waiting to be reunited with our fathers. Their fathers who had been detained in Department of Justice internment camps. On the very same highway is the South Texas Family Residential Center. And in that moment, Tsuru for Solidarity was formed. We had no idea when we sent out word to our Japanese American communities that we would receive such an overwhelming response. We hoped for 10,000 paper cranes to hang on the fence where the children and mothers were confined. We wanted them to see the bright colors of hope. By the time we arrived in Texas in March, we had received from all across the country almost 30,000 paper cranes. We had hoped a taiko drum would help us send the children a message that they would be able to hear the beating of our hearts. And drummers, One World Taiko and So Taiko, had loaded trucks and drove to South Texas from Denver and New York. With these wings of hope and the beating of our hearts, we let the children know that someone outside cared, that someone outside was protesting what was being done to them. But what we didn't expect was that there would be a healing for us. That by speaking out and showing up, our community, fractured by our wartime trauma, experienced a new sense of community, of belonging, of shared purpose. We didn't know that the power of our shared voices would be like shards ripping away the scabs of silence. We didn't know that the small act of folding a paper crane would speak to so many people in our community. In protest, we chanted, we raised our fists. For the children, we sang in Spanish, De Colores. We held hands and sang in Japanese, O Te Te. And we found ourselves singing, not only for the children, but for our grandmothers and our grandfathers, for our mothers and fathers. We didn't know there would be a healing for us. By lifting up both memory and action through our intergenerational effort, our mixed race identities, intersectional and cross-cultural coalitions, we are discovering a renewed sense of identity and empowerment, compelling us to lend our voices and join others on the front line to protest the inhumane criminalization of today's innocent people. And we will continue to demand no more U.S. concentration camps. Thank you.